In a world racing toward clean energy, who's left behind? Welcome to Eyes on a Just Energy Transition, the program that highlights on Africa's journey toward a fair and inclusive energy future.
Hello, our dear listener. Welcome to Witness Radio, your trusted voice. You are listening to Eyes on a Just Energy Transition, where we take you on an informative journey of energy transition across the globe. And this is the Witness Radio series program, The Media in Renewable Energy. In this series, we are using the power of the media to shine a light on the world's journey towards clean, sustainable energy. To listen to us, visit our website www.witnessradio.org or visit Google Play Store and download the Witness Radio app. And in case you'd like to reach us out, please chat with us on our WhatsApp +256 745 965 765 or by calling us directly on +256 414 697 221, and we shall hear from you, or on all our social media platforms. Now, as you may know, that globally, countries are currently on an energy transition journey, moving away from the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas, and firewood to renewable or clean energy. And this transition journey is expected to deliver enormous socio-economic benefits to all these countries, including improving energy access, creating jobs, and boosting energy security. And so, to achieve these benefits, these countries must make a great turn away from burning fossil fuels and firewood. Therefore, in this program, we bring you different renewable energy experts to enlighten us as they share with us their experiences about the transition journey of the renewable or clean energy. Currently, many countries are working hard to produce the clean energy that will drive them away from the fossil fuels and the use of firewood. Now, this transition journey to clean energy is one of the most significant changes of our time in the world today. It signifies a change from an economy based on finite and environmentally harmful fossil fuels to one that is environmentally friendly, powered by clean, sustainable, and naturally replenished sources like sunlight, wind, water, and geothermal heat. This helps to address the climate change issues and empowers the citizens to benefit from that clean energy. The pressing global challenges include climate change, air pollution, and the need for more energy security. Also to note is that over 30% of the world's electricity is currently produced using renewable energy, but many people are still ignorant of how this change is occurring, who is influencing it, and what laws and agreements govern it. And now, with the current conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran, it displays the dangerous state that the rest of the world is facing, which emanates from the power struggles, especially the fossil fuel geopolitics that have continued to influence the world economic developments, but do not mind about the well-being of the ordinary persons. We therefore elevate discussion through this program, where every episode gives us in-depth conversations with practitioners, policymakers, and experts to examine the shift to renewable energy from a global viewpoint. We examine the evolution's history, significant turning points, and international treaties, agreements, and policies that are impacting nations' adoption and regulation of renewable energy. Our mission is straightforward: to provide the world with the information it needs to understand how national and international decisions impact energy systems, economies, and daily lives, as well as how the shift to renewable energy is influencing our shared future. And so, in today's episode, therefore, we bring you an expert in energy policy, Sandrine Dixson-Declève. She served as co-president of the Club of Rome from 2018 to 2024 and now acts as its global ambassador while leading the executive chair of Earth for All and the Brussels-based Systems Transformation Hub both promoting economic, financial and government systems change for a sustainable future, enhancing well-being. Sandrine Dixson-Declève sits on the Climate Governance Commission and the newly formed WHO Pan-European Climate and Health Commission. She has advised governments, businesses and international organizations, chaired the European Commission's expert group on economic and social impact of research and innovation, ESIR, and has served on boards and advisory boards of Climate, KIC, Lord's Foundation, Imperial College London, UCL, BMW, UCB, and EDP. A TED speaker and author, she co-wrote Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, and advocates for bold climate action, economic reform, and social equity to address global challenges. Sandrine currently teaches at the College of Europe. Now, Sandrine Dixson-Declève is the expert we have for you today at Witness Radio. She is going to share with us about energy transition and as well enlighten us on why countries in the world today are now seriously transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable or clean energy. But before Sandrine comes in, let's first go for a commercial break, and when we return, we will listen to her.
In a world racing toward clean energy, who's left behind? Welcome to Eyes on a Just Energy Transition, the program that highlights on Africa's journey toward a fair and inclusive energy future.
Ladies and gentlemen,
you're tuned into Witness Radio, where truth meets the airwaves. Stay with us for real stories. Witness Radio, your story, your voice.
The world is moving toward renewable energy, but will it be just for everyone? Tune in to Eyes on a Just Energy Transition every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 a.m. East African Standard Time, where we explore how Africa can embrace clean energy without leaving communities behind. Because justice must fuel the transition. The energy future is here, but who benefits?
Welcome back from that commercial break. And now let's begin today's episode with Sandrine Dixson-Declève, an energy policy expert. Now, renewable energy transition is the global journey today for most countries moving away from the burning of fossil fuels to clean energy. We also know that there is an increase in the global investment in clean energy. According to the 2024 World Energy Investment Report, the Middle East accounts for about 30% of global oil production. And now the current conflict between Iran, US, and Israel. And all these are because of power struggles for oil and gas production. Can you explain to us what really this journey is of the renewable energy transition?
I think we need to look at history and geopolitics. If you already go back to the 1970s, countries started to question their dependency on fossil fuels. In the 1970s, there was the big oil crisis because there was conflict in the Middle East. And now look where we are today, just this weekend, with the dependency that we have on oil and gas. We know that the price of oil and gas will go up exponentially this week because of what's happening right now in terms of the war between Israel and Iran. So I think that the geopolitical element is really important on fossil energy. So that's the first. And that is one of the reasons why there has been conversations across the globe around reducing that dependency and looking at the potential for either sovereign fossil energy or shifting towards renewables. Of course, the other key element is climate change. And for me, as someone who's been working in sustainability my entire life, I've watched how much climate change because of the fact that we, for the first time last year, already surpassed 1.5 degrees. And so we will be seeing increasingly impacts on water, on desertification, but in some areas more and more floods, tornadoes, hurricanes. So weather will be increasingly impacted, and people's lives and livelihoods will be increasingly impacted. And the number one emission of greenhouse gases is coming from the burning of fossil energy. So it is that dual reason, both the geopolitical dependency, but also the need to shift towards renewables, that is really driving this transition.
We thank you for that response, really. And just to look at our second questions, can you give us a brief history of energy transition, when and how it started? I know you have hinted about it, but if maybe you could a little bit to go further.
Sure. I mean, I've actually been working in the area of energy since the early 90s. And we could already see the transition happening in investment and diversification, predominantly in the oil and gas companies. We know that the civilizational shifts across history predominantly occurred through the use, actually, of solar energy and of wood, predominantly wood burning. But if you go then into what we call so-called modern history, the shift towards fossil energy in the 1900s has really created this dependency and this holding of the power in those countries that actually have fossil energy. And I think what's interesting is to see that the going back towards renewables, in particular in the 90s, but also in the 80s, following the 1970s oil embargoes and the issues that we saw in the Middle East. Again, this really was the preeminence and the start of looking at renewables again, especially in the United States, and also the different types of sectors that are dependent on fossil energy, both transport and industry, and looking at shifts. I mean, I grew up in California, even though I live in Belgium, and I am Belgian. But if you look at already in the 80s and the 90s, both in California and the United States, but also in Japan, we were already starting to look at the electrification of vehicles. And we were looking at the potential of renewables energy, in particular solar energy. So I think that we can see that there was a growing shift and interest, predominantly because of an understanding of our dependencies on oil and gas, towards renewable energy. However, what has always happened is even the investments in renewables were predominantly in those days undertaken by big oil and gas companies. And oil and gas shareholders have always followed short-term profits, and in this way have also tried to capture the market and to make sure that renewables and also electrification did not progress at the pace and scale that it should have progressed. And I think this has been really one of the key issues that we are confronted with, is the power of the oil and gas companies that are constraining the transition. And we're seeing it again now in terms of the United States now turning its back on renewables, and also to a certain degree across Europe, where we're seeing a bit of a backtracking in terms of investments in renewables, because oil and gas companies are very much capturing the market, pulling out of some of their interests, pulling out of our net zero commitment, and very much wanting to just follow short-term gains and short-term profiteering on the back of people. And that is incredibly problematic.
When you look at the transition, especially the big oil and the gas countries you've talked about, which have influence and the power over the oil and the gas companies, we've seen some of them, like Total, investing in fossil fuels and at the same time investing in renewable energy practices. How do you term this?
So, I don't necessarily have a problem with the big oil majors investing in renewables, as long as they truly promote and push the shift and the transition. But what they've tried to do predominantly is control the market. And that is problematic. And so, yes, that we need to shift away. The only way to control this is to have and invest more and more in independent renewable companies that are able to truly offer both solar and wind, but also energy efficiency. I mean, what we also need is we need to look at an optimization of the market. You know, the cheapest energy and the best energy is the energy we don't use. The second cheapest and best energy is the energy that is driven and generated at the community level, that is very much optimized for the people that actually need it where they are. So community solutions, small scale solar, small scale energy possibilities, whether it be through pellets or sometimes burning of biomass. These are some of the options that are fundamental. Of course, the problem is that big government and across the globe, but we've seen it also in Africa and some of the scenarios that I undertook with Sustainable Energy for All, which is the UN agency that has been very much looking at how to bring more energy to Africa. We know that it's incredibly important to have small-scale solutions, not just large-scale centralized solutions. So decentralization is also fundamental, and that hacks the power of the big company.
What were the challenges these countries faced when they were moving to the new energies that were being invented? Historical as you narrated to us how this history moved. Because it seems like they were not looking at the challenges that were befalling, and they just wanted to achieve what they were aiming at, the new goals, inventing a new energy and then move to it, and then from that one to then to the other one. Were they not looking at the challenges that befall?
There are always challenges when we shift to different types of technology. Yes. So I think that was a given, and I think most countries knew about these challenges. But I think it's very different where you are. In Europe, the biggest challenge has been predominantly the permitting challenges, but also the infrastructural challenges and the transmission lines and distribution. So, in a similar way, for example, in Africa, if we were going to put across large-scale energy possibilities that were either solar or wind, it's incredibly important to look at the possibility of going beyond borders. And this has been one of the key issues at the European level. Even though we have a single market, we have not properly put in place the transmission and the distribution elements of our infrastructure, which was fundamental. In addition to that, in Europe, permitting takes far too long. So we have not been able to put in place the permitting requirements and the possibilities and enable actually for new solar and also wind production sites to come online fast enough in comparison with the United States, for example. I think these are some of the key issues. But what is interesting is also the fact that we haven't addressed the core of the problem. And the core of the problem is that we have continued to subsidize fossil energy. Globally, we are subsidizing fossil energy at $900 billion per year. But in addition, we are also not taxing windfall profits. And big oil and gas companies globally are making about $2.8 billion in windfall profits. So what we've done is we've continued with an age-old perverse system which continues to enable oil and gas to both be produced and consumed at a cheaper rate than renewables. And then we've made the transition more difficult by not enhancing the possibility of getting permits and investing in the right infrastructure in order to make sure that everyone has access to renewable energy. And in the case of transport, that everyone has access to electrification, electrical vehicles at a cheaper price, and also the possible charging stations, etc. So there was not enough thinking that went into the infrastructural elements of shifting the economy. But what I want to say, and this is something that most people don't realize, is actually the global energy transition is accelerating. The Chinese will not go back. They are investing millions in terms of both their electrification infrastructure, their battery production, their electrical vehicle production, as well as solar and wind. And so if any country thinks that we're going back to fossil energy, they are wrong. For the moment, we're seeing a backlash. But the fact of the matter is that the new decarbonized energy system is here and it is growing. And that is so important for countries across the globe who are thinking of transitioning to understand that if they want to be both sovereign and also performing in terms of new technology investments, this is the market to get into.
Yes, before we proceed, let's go for a commercial break, and when we return, we shall proceed with the program.
Breaking the silence and elevating community voices. Witness Radio, your number one choice.
In a world racing toward clean energy, who's left behind? Welcome to Eyes on a Just Energy Transition, the program that highlights on Africa's journey toward a fair and inclusive energy future.
Tune in to Witness Radio. Witness Radio.
Welcome back from that break. Now, oil and gas companies are investing in renewable and clean energy, but these again still prioritize fossil fuels operations. And you talked of power struggles whereby those investing in fossil fuels are also having significant powers. I wanted to understand, how are you managing these power struggles? Because as the world is transiting to the renewable energy, there also comes in those who want to invest in fossil fuels. And yet, as you've just said, the transition is moving on smoothly. How are you managing the power struggles? Why does the transition stand?
Yeah, these are very good questions. I think that with regard to the power, and again, having worked with the oil and gas sector in the 90s and the beginning of 2000, they will hold on. The oil and gas sectors will hold on as long as possible, as will those big countries that produce, because they want to create the dependencies and they want the short-term profits. The pushback has to come from enabling the transition in countries that are, in particular, those on the demand side. Europe is no longer a major producer of oil and gas. It has to shift. And for the moment, it has continued to be dependent on oil and gas coming from the Middle East, coming obviously from Russia. I mean, the entire Ukrainian invasion is because the openness, in particular from Germany through Nord Stream 2 and the construction of Nord Stream 2 to enable more gas to come from Russia. And this enabled Putin to have the power that he needed to know that he could invade Ukraine without much pushback. And this is where we are today. And I think that the only way that we will be able to shift and break that power is on the demand side. So we have to figure out ways for countries that are dependent to actually invest in renewables. One way to do that, as I said, is to take the perversities out of the market. Make sure that oil and gas is more costly than actually renewables. And we know that, for example, 91% of new renewable projects are now cheaper than fossil fuel projects. So it is affordable. So this is the number one point, is to shift the demand mechanism away from fossil energy supply and to shift that into renewable projects and renewable energy, both in terms of centralized and decentralized potential. And I think that is very important. And we can see the same across Africa. I mean, Africa has the potential, in particular in terms of solar, that is even much greater than Europe is. It also has the potential in wind. It also has the potential on optimizing its systems so that it can become more energy efficient. And of course, decentralized solutions at the community level are fundamental. So we need to really hack this continued dependency on fossil energy supply by taxing fossil energy, making it more expensive, making renewables more affordable, and enabling people to have access to renewable energy. Big issue right now is the obsession with short-term profits. And we're going to have to convince the investment community, and I think they're getting there. Look at what's happening right now in the Middle East, where the insurance sector is actually not insuring cargo ships to get into the Bay of Hormuz. I think that if we start to see that it's getting riskier and riskier to invest in oil and gas, then that will also have an impact on the shift. And then to get to the way in which the market is transitioning, I mean, we see that solar and wind now have met new electricity demands in the first 3 quarters of 2025. So this is, now we're saying that actually renewable sources are generating more electricity than coal. I sat on the board of a Portuguese electricity company, EDP, and EDP will be fully out of coal by 2030 here in Europe. So what they have done is they've actually transitioned their electrification and their electricity facilities out of coal into renewables, and they've brought people on the journey. So they have not fired their staff, they've actually retrained their staff, reskilled their staff, and brought them on the journey. Because often the criticism is that we're going to lose jobs. This is absolutely false. In fact, renewable energy creates as many jobs, if not more, than fossil energy. We also in 2024 had a record high for energy transition investment, reaching about 2.4 trillion, which is a 20% increase from the 2022 to 2023 levels. And global renewable capacity, because of this, was set to reach about 793 gigawatts in 2025. So you can see that actually the market is doing very well and it is robust. And I think this is also one of the reasons why the oil and gas sector is getting worried. Now, where I do feel that there is a real problem is the way in which AI and digitalization, but in particular AI, has a thirst for energy and water, by the way. And this is also one of the reasons why the United States is backtracking on its commitments in renewables, because it really wants to push cheap energy for the generation of AI. And this is where we need to be very careful, is to see how much we are going to give in to continuing to burn fossil energy because of AI dependency, rather than really up our investments on renewables and making sure that we enhance the transition. I am very worried about the pressures coming from AI.
So when transiting from dirty energy to clean energy, there are policies, laws, and frameworks at international level that are enabling this movement. Can you tell us what these are and why they were established?
Sure, absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, we have our net zero targets and our Paris Agreement target to move towards net zero by 2050. Europe is one of the regions that is shifting in this direction very rapidly. Of course, the United States has left what we call the climate agreements, the COP agreements, and no longer wants to meet and match any of the net zero targets. But what we are seeing is there is a growing coalition of the willing. And in fact, having been at the last climate negotiations, so the parties come together every year at these climate negotiations. The last one was in Belém in Brazil, where I was. And in Brazil, the Brazilians, actually, President Lula, pushed for a roadmap for the phase out of fossil energy and the move towards net zero by 2050. Sadly, this did not actually get agreed. It was blocked by Saudi Arabia, by Venezuela, by Russia, and of course by the United States. Even though the United States was not there, it was pushing behind the scenes. But what is interesting is that Colombia will be hosting many countries from across the globe to come forward with a continued push for the phase out of fossil fuels. And I think this is a really interesting development. And we are seeing many countries that are moving now towards the belief that we have to transition and we have to meet our 2050 targets of net zero. In Europe, we also have what we call our EU policy acceleration. So we've revised our energy directive, aiming for 42.5 to 45% renewable share by 2030. This is driven by what we call our Repower Europe plan to reduce dependency on Russian fossil fuels. China and India are also pushing in this direction and are enhancing their commitments, even though they don't have yet 100% commitment. But China is definitely moving in this direction. So what you see is the COP agreements, what we call the COP agreements, which are the overall umbrella at the international level. This really calls for transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems and tripling global renewable energy capacity by 2030. And then you have the different continents and different countries who have their own commitments. And this is where they put in their own legislation to meet these net zero commitments. But there's also another very important development. And I was very active in the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, where we brought together businesses from across the globe to also commit to moving towards net zero. And I think this is very important because beyond the commitments at the national level, we need commitments at the corporate level, at the business level, at the industrial level to reduce the impact of emissions coming from their production processes. And this is where we had a net zero agreement across companies from across the globe. And sadly, since the United States has been pushing out any commitment towards climate, we're seeing more and more, especially American companies, pull out of their net zero commitment. But this is a very important, let's say, balanced, holistic approach of what we call the non-state actors, working with state actors to come forward with their net zero commitments. Now, even though we do see some pushback for the moment, and we do see a focus in particular in Europe and the United States because of the Ukrainian invasion, because of the pullout of the US and NATO, and therefore an increasing focus on defense and on competitiveness, and therefore the backlash in some ways on climate. We have seen that Europe is staying the course, is not pulling out of its commitments. In fact, it just renewed its 2040 commitments for a 90% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But still, we do see a lot of corporations that are, let's say, slowing down their commitments at this time. And this is quite problematic.
Thank you, Sandrine. Yeah, but also I wanted to understand again more, just from your assessment about this commitment from African countries, and of course around the world, the commitment they have made to ensure that you achieve the goal, net zero goal by 2050. Just from your own assessment, do you see the commitment like already in action? Are we moving there? You are sure that by 2050 we shall achieve the goal? And then also, what happens to countries that seem to be ignoring the call?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing in terms of the trends is, for example, bioenergy is remaining the largest source of renewable energy, in particular in Africa. But solar PV is also a technology which is on track with net zero by 2050 scenarios. So we are seeing that this is moving forward. And across Africa, there's a rapid transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, aiming for a sustainable low carbon future by 2050. And by the way, there are also many commitments now coming from the DRC and other parts of Africa that are looking also at deforestation, because from a climate perspective, we need to both reduce our impact on the energy side and transition, but we also need to make sure that we don't deforest our regions, because that is truly problematic, both in terms of land use and emissions and carbon absorption, but also a problem in terms of more and more impacts coming from flooding, etc. So what we're seeing in Africa, this transition is actually moving very fast, both in terms of solar, hydro, and bioenergy. We've seen, for example, that there's been a 8.5 billion pledge to what we call the Just Energy Transition Partnership in Kenya, but also in South Africa. Kenya now has 80% renewable electricity, and Morocco 40% renewable capacity, with also a focus on green hydrogen. Ethiopia is 98%, and the DRC is also moving very fast towards 95%. And South Africa is aggressively investing in solar and wind to replace aging coal. So we are seeing significant investments in Africa, and Africa is also positioning itself in terms of green hydrogen as a sustainable alternative to oil and gas. And then hydroelectricity is also a quite dominant source. So I think that what we're seeing is the possible transition. We also are seeing that in particular in Africa, the region is very much feeling the pain of climate change. And we have to remember, and this is a conversation I have with governments, that the cost of inaction, so not investing in renewables, not transitioning towards decarbonization, is actually costing us about 3% GDP per annum globally. And what we're seeing in the most vulnerable nations is as we move towards 3 degrees, so at 1.5 degrees, which is the current calculation, we're losing up to 3% of GDP. As we move towards 3 degrees, and we think we could be potentially at 2 degrees by 2040, maybe 2050, but I think it'll probably be earlier, sadly, we could lose up to 17% of GDP. So if governments are really wanting to buffer GDP and make sure that actually they preserve and create more resilient economies for the future, they have to move towards decarbonized energy. We have to reduce our impact on climate change. This is the only way forward.
Yes, before we proceed, let's go for a commercial break, and when we return, we shall proceed with this wonderful conversation where our energy policy expert, Sandrine Dixson-Declève, enlightens us on renewable energy or clean energy transition journey.
Ladies and gentlemen,
You're tuned into Witness Radio, where truth meets the airwaves. Stay with us for real stories. Witness Radio, your story, your voice.
Welcome back from that break. You are listening to Eyes on a Just Energy Transition at Witness Radio, where we take you on an informative journey, and now focusing on the global journey of the renewable energy transition. And we continue with our energy policy expert today, Sandrine Dixson-Declève. Actually, there is something that comes to my mind when you talk about this. We are seeing that Africa is one of those hard hit by climate impacts. And one of the questions that I want to pose to you is that when you look at Africa, it is welcoming when it comes to investments, and many of these have been impactful when it comes to environment, and of course lead to major climate blows. So when you look at projects like monoculture, tree plantation, which scientists say aren't good to the soils, when you look at these oil and gas projects, which are very much welcomed in Africa, where some African countries regard as major drivers of development. Do you still think that the fight for transition in Africa is on, and do you see some progress? Because you just mentioned in countries like Ethiopia and many others, but I wanted to put it to your attention that scientists say that these continue to damage the environment. Do you see progress mainly in the countries of the global south?
I think that we need to realize that this is an opportunity for countries of the global south to leapfrog and to adopt new practices. It's difficult though, and I'm not naive. If you go back to obviously the Club of Rome and having been co-president of the Club of Rome, and I'm still a global ambassador for the Club of Rome, we published in 1972 the seminal report, The Limits to Growth. And of course, we need to understand that there are parts of the world that still need to develop economically. I think that it's at this time, we need to understand that there are different pathways towards growth. And in particular, as I said, we have to understand that GDP is a broken measure. If we continue to only measure productivity, then there will always be a push towards quick gains with regard to productivity. Quick gains, by the way, that don't often trickle down to the masses of people because governments are not servicing the needs of people. They're just pocketing the profits for themselves. And we obviously haven't yet talked about the corruption around the energy sector, which is also incredibly problematic. So we need to figure out, how do we actually create these transition plans that enable more people to be on the journey, to have access to affordable energy, and to be able to thrive, not just survive. And this fallacy that has been given both by governments to people, but also by the major financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, that actually GDP enables more people to come out of poverty, is now completely and utterly untrue. So let me give you an example of this. The UN Development Program has just come out with its report in 2025 on human development, which for the first time ever shows that actually human progress is going backwards, not forward. We are not investing in people's lives and livelihoods across the globe. Inequality has grown more than ever before, even in the global north, as much as it has in the global south. So this is incredibly problematic, and it forces us to rethink our models, our economic models of growth and our governance models. It forces us to think about what is the possibility for those low and middle income countries to actually continue to aspire towards more economic stability, but not have the same growth models based on extraction that we have seen in the past. And I know it's difficult because the immediate argument is, but hold on, the global north, on the back of colonialism, grew and exploited and extracted and made its power and its profit from that. Why is it that we cannot? The biggest issue we have is that we no longer are in an empty world. We're in a full world where actually we have less and less resources to enable us to actually be economically sound and economically stable. And so a good resilience plan for Africa is to rise above this idea that we need to do as the West did, and instead prove us wrong in terms of new scenarios. And this is why we published Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, where we're actually working with South Africa and Kenya to demonstrate different pathways of reducing inequality, reducing poverty, empowering women and men to actually own their land, to be part of the economy, to have access to education, and address the big impacts of food and energy. Because as you said before, it's not just the way in which we burn fossil energy that is getting us into trouble. It's the way we use land. It's the way in which we have put in place Western scenarios for land usage that is depleting the land rather than regenerating the land. And that is why regenerative practices and sustainable practices are so important. So this would be my response. We have to figure out ways to work together in partnership to demonstrate new models that actually enable countries to thrive across the globe. Otherwise, I'm very fearful that it will only get worse in terms of the climatic impacts, but also instability, because the demand for water will get increasingly more acute, both because of AI, but also because of needs across our industries, and of course, in terms of people needing access to water. But the fact is that our water will dry up increasingly because of climate change. Our land will become increasingly more dry and more difficult actually to grow certain foods because of climate change. So if we do not solve this situation soon by shifting our practices, by stopping the extraction, by looking at new economic models of what we call economic well-being, then we will very much see extreme pressure points across the globe.
One thing that came in my mind as you're explaining is the issue of financing. It has been noted that it's one of the challenges hindering the journey. What's your take on this?
Finance is the biggest challenge. And if you look in particular, for example, across the globe, we need to increase annual investments by about 40 to 65 billion. So that is absolutely correct. And it will continue to be an issue across the globe, but also in particular in Africa. I think the biggest issue that we're seeing in Africa in terms of finance is the riskiness. Investors are risk averse with governments that are not always the most stable. And by the way, in the United States, it's not very stable either. But if you look across the globe in a variety of different places where there has been a history of instability, then you will see that the investment community does not actually want to invest. And this is very problematic because it will only push to more instability as we move forward. That's why the IMF, the World Bank, most of the national banks are really looking at different types of financial instruments to ensure that actually we bring in the just transition. You know, what's interesting is, for example, the European Investment Bank is now called the Climate Bank, and they have ceased to invest in coal projects and are upping their investment predominantly in renewables. In terms of the African Development Bank, it has ceased funding as well of new coal projects, and it's signaling a strong commitment to clean energy. So we are seeing that some of the public banks, the institutional banks, are moving in this direction. We also are seeing that some of the central banks are also shifting and looking at the risks of continuing to finance and enable big fossil energy projects. But I think it's also the private sector. It's very important that the private sector steps up. But as I said, in those areas, countries that are unstable, and it's very difficult to get either the private or the public sector to finance in transitioning projects. And it becomes a bit of a catch-22 because, of course, they will only get more unstable as there are more climatic impacts and as there is less of potential to have access to clean, affordable energy.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for that explanation. But another issue is the penalties. Are there penalties that come forward, for example, for countries that have failed to adhere to the call of this transition and have continued to either stubbornly or because they have found new developments for their countries and so they do not mind? Are there penalties for such countries?
Sadly, no. And I think this is truly problematic. We need more and more sanctions The way in which we were looking at penalties was predominantly through criteria at the investment level, in the sense that by putting more and more criteria to move towards renewable energy at the investment level, and seeing that investors would not invest in brown energy, this was the best way to shift capital and therefore to make countries realize that it was no longer beneficial to invest in brown energy or in oil and gas. But we're seeing that because of the big pushback, in particular towards environmentally and sustainable and governance criteria, what we call the ESG criteria, which has governed predominantly the investment community over the last few years to enable this transition, that because the United States has predominantly pulled out of these ESG requirements alongside its investment community as well as its corporate community, not everywhere, but in many cases, then we see that there is less of that pressure point that is coming forward. But in terms of international sanctions, we see that this is not happening. And this is really problematic because it is not creating then the big push. You have the stick and the carrot, and you need a bit of both. And this is also why I call for the need to tax windfall profits, to eliminate subsidies. There needs to be a global agreement to eliminate subsidies to oil and gas, and to really start to tax the oil and gas companies, both in terms of their windfall profits, but also in terms of their productivity. And if they start feeling it at the pump, then maybe there will be a real shift away. But until that happens, I don't think we're going to have the extra push. That said, we are seeing again the risk element. And the risk element in and of itself is becoming, whether it's through the insurance community or whether it's through the investment community, that investing in oil and gas may become increasingly risky, especially if you see what's happening right now in terms of the conflict between Israel and Iran and the way in which the Middle East is being pulled into it. If you look this week at what is going to happen in terms of our markets and in terms of the increase in price of oil and gas, and then more and more people who are going to get upset in different countries, it is those countries that actually have invested in other resources, in particular renewables and energy efficiency, that are going to be much stronger as they service their customers and as they service their citizens with clean energy.
Thank you so much, Sandrine, for that. And as we wrap up today's episode, you should be reminded that globally, countries are on the journey transiting from fossil fuels to renewable energy or clean cooking. And this requires you too to embrace the efforts and be part of the great transformation. And before we end the program, please, if you want to listen to us, visit our website www.witnessradio.org or visit Google Play Store and download the Witness Radio app. And in case you would like to reach out to us, please chat with us on our WhatsApp +256 745 965 765 or by calling us directly on +256 414 697 221, and we shall hear from you or on all our social media platforms. Thank you for keeping it locked on Witness Radio. Stay tuned, stay informed, and stay inspired to be part of the energy revolution. Please do not forget that Eyes on a Just Energy Transition airs on Witness Radio every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 a.m. East African Standard Time. Catch us again at the same time, same radio station. I am Will Stephen, your host.
Eyes on a Just Energy Transition, a program that unpacks Africa's shift toward cleaner, fairer, and more sustainable energy. Join us every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 a.m. East African Standard Time as we spotlight communities, policies, and voices shaping the continent's energy future. Stay informed, stay empowered. Keep your eyes on a just energy transition.
right here on Witness Radio.